The winter wind in the high Rockies never merely blows, it scrapes. It drags its claws across the ridgelines, dives into the narrow valleys like a living thing, and tests every structure built by human hands. In the winter of 1823, at a remote trapping camp tucked along a tributary of the Green River, every man believed he understood that wind. They believed they knew from bitter experience how a cabin should be built to survive it. That's why they laughed when they saw Jedediah Cole's place. His cabin sat farther up the draw than the others, pressed against a low rock outcrop, with the way a man leans his back against a warm stove. From the outside, it looked like a straightforward log shelter, tight notching good timbers, nothing flashy. But the moment someone stepped inside, they saw it, an extra wall built 1.5 feet inside the north and west sides of the room. A wall that didn't seem to support anything, didn't add storage, didn't contribute to strength. Just a strange inner barrier, stealing precious floor space from a man who would need every inch to survive a mountain winter. The trappers didn't spare him. Cole's building a cabin for squirrels. Never seen a man so scared of a breeze he boards himself in twice. The old fool's gone soft in the head. They called it the stupid wall. They called his home the trash house. Some even joked they'd come check on him midwinter just to see if he froze upright next to that silly plank wall. Jedediah didn't argue. He rarely did. He simply nodded, carved a few more shavings from the board he was planing, and kept working. But 3 months later, during a storm that pinned even the hardiest mountain men inside their cabins for 5 straight days, something happened that none of them expected. Snow drifted to the eaves. The wind screamed like a tortured flute through the cottonwoods. In every other shelter, men huddled close to their fireplaces, feeding the flames constantly just to keep the frost from forming on their blankets. And then word spread quiet, hesitant disbelieving. Jed's fire was barely more than a bed of coals, yet his cabin was warm. Not less cold, not bearable, but genuinely warm, nearly 30 degrees warmer than the draftiest cabin in camp. The laughter died in that storm. What replaced it was curiosity and a little unease. Because if Jedediah Cole's stupid wall worked, then everything the mountain men thought they knew about surviving winter in the Rockies was about to change. Long before the trappers of Cottonwood Camp met him, Jedediah Cole had already lived several lives. By the winter of 1823, he was 50 years old, an age that made him almost ancient among mountain men, whose bones usually broke or froze long before that half-century mark. His hair, once a dark frontier brown, had surrendered to gray around the temples. His beard hung thick and uneven, stiffened by frost on cold mornings and smoke on long nights. But it was his back, not his beard, that told his story. Jed had once been a stonemason in upstate New York, shaping foundations, chimneys, and cellar walls for farmhouses that were built to outlast the men paying for them. He knew the weight of stone, the way a sailor knows the weight of canvas, through Callus's repetition, and the 1,000 little lessons only years can teach. When the beaver trade called him west, he brought more than a rifle and a gambler's hope. He brought the mason's instinct for heat and cold. In the east, he had built homes where a small, steady fire kept a family warm all winter. Thick walls, tight joints, heavy hearthstones that soaked up heat by day and released it slow and faithful through the night. He'd also built the mistakes houses where everything looked right, but drafts slipped through like thieves. Places where no amount of wood could soften the winter. He knew that difference deep in his bones. The Rockies, though, played by harsher rules. Winter didn't knock, it kicked the door off its hinges. By Jed's 5th season in the mountains, he was tired in a way that didn't show on the face, but lived in the joints. He watched boys half his age fell tree after tree swinging axes until their breath steamed like engine smoke. They'd haul log after log through knee-deep snow, stack the woodpile higher, then burn through it in a week of hard weather. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't skill. It was brute force against a force far more brutal. Jed saw the cost: twisted backs, burned hands, nights lost to feeding a starving fire. He felt his own spine grind when he lifted logs, now a reminder that he no longer had decades to waste on bad design. It wasn't the cold that scared him. He'd slept on frozen ground, crossed passes in whiteouts, seen a man freeze stiff as a post beside a trail. That kind of death was quick and honest. What scared Jed was the slow theft of winter, how it stole a man's daylight, how it stole his strength, one armload of firewood at a time, how it stole entire seasons of life, leaving nothing behind but smoke and ash. Some men fought the cold with bigger fires. Jed wanted to fight it with fewer, and somewhere deep in his memory, he could still picture those old farmhouses back east, quiet, solid places where warmth lingered long after the fire had died. Houses with walls that worked with the fire instead of against it. If he could build something like that up here, something that didn't devour his time and his woodpile, he might just buy himself back a few winters of life. And that thought was worth more than all the jokes the camp could muster. Jedediah Cole hadn't meant to become a student of heat. But a lifetime of building for cold climates had trained his hands and eyes long before he ever stepped into the Rockies. Back in New York, where winters were wet and heavy but not murderous like mountain frost, Jed learned that the difference between a warm house and a cold one wasn't the size of the fire, it was the character of the walls. He had worked on farmhouses where the hearth was so small a child could straddle it, yet the home stayed comfortably warm through the darkest months. Thick stone, tight joints, heavy floors, everything held the heat like a deep breath. And then there were the pretenders' houses that looked beautiful from the road, but shivered like a sick dog the moment December settled in. Jed had watched families throw cord after cord of wood into wide fireplaces that heated the air for a moment, only to watch it slide away through cracks they couldn't see. He didn't learn that from books. He learned it by kneeling in the cold mud with trowel in hand, patching the mistakes of other men. Heat, he realized, had 3 escape routes: conduction, convection, and radiation, though he rarely used those words. He knew conduction by the way cold stone sucked the warmth from his palms. He knew convection by the way wind tunneled through gaps invisible to the eye but obvious to the skin. He knew radiation by the way a well-built hearth warmed a room even after the flames died. He had spent years reading temperature not with tools but with fingertips and breath. So when he crossed into the Rocky Mountains and spent his first winters in log cabins slapped together to survive a season, not a decade, Jed felt something was wrong. Not with the men most were strong, young, unafraid, but with the belief they carried. Big fire solves everything. They lived by it. They died by it too. Cabins were built fast and thin. Gaps chinked once, maybe twice, if the builder had patience. Roofs leaned low under snow, floors stayed damp, and the wind, always the wind, pushed its way through every forgotten crack. A roaring fire could make the front of a man's shirt sweat while the back of his neck felt like it was pressed against a block of ice. Jed would sit in these cabins listening to the fire devour log after log and feel the heat vanish through the walls as surely as if someone had lifted the roof off. It wasn't ignorance, it was tradition. Men built the way their fathers and uncles had built. They added more wood when it was cold, blamed the storm when it didn't work, and accepted that deep winter meant misery. But Jed couldn't ignore the contradiction. Here he was in a land full of resourcefulness men who could rig a snare from 3 twigs, cross a frozen river, with a willow pole stitch a pair of moccasins from rawhide, and yet cabin building remained locked in old habits. The Rockies were different from New York. The air was drier. The nights were colder. The storms were angrier. And the margin for error was razor thin. Jed asked himself the question no one else bothered with. What if the problem isn't the fire? What if the problem is everything around it? If the fire was the worker, the walls were the manager. A good worker could only do so much under a bad boss, and so Jed's restless mind returned to the lessons of masonry. the homes where warmth stayed, not because the flame burned hotter, but because the walls refused to let the heat escape. He didn't yet know exactly how he'd build his winter cabin up in the draw, but he knew one thing for certain. If he wanted to survive the Rockies without sacrificing half his life to the woodpile, he would need a wall that could fight smarter, not harder. Jedediah Cole believed a cabin began long before man lifted his axe. It began with the land itself, the shape of the valley, the direction of the prevailing winds, the path the winter sun carved across the sky. Most trappers picked their spots by convenience flat ground, near the creek, close to the horses, close to the others. Jed preferred to start with silence. On a late August morning, when summer was beginning to fray around the edges, he walked the length of the draw north of Cottonwood Camp. The cottonwoods clung to the creek like a ragged ribbon of green, but Jed was looking higher toward a low stone shoulder jutting out of the hillside. The formation wasn't tall, maybe 9 feet from base to crown, but it curved forward like a protective arm. A natural windbreak. A massive piece of earth that had been soaking up sun for centuries. That Jed thought is where a man should lean his back in winter. He climbed the slope boots, grinding on gravel and dry soil, and stood with his palms pressed to the sun-warmed rock. Even in late summer, when nights could drop surprisingly cold, the stone held a gentle heat. To a mason like Jed, that heat was a kind of language. Stone remembered the day, and it forgot slowly. It was steady, reliable, the opposite of a flash-in-the-pan frontier fire. He walked a full circle around the outcrop, taking note of the shadows. The sun's arc dipped low to the south. In winter, every eastern builder knew that. But mountains complicated things. The valley walls could steal half a day of sunlight if a man wasn't careful. Jed spent 3 days rising before dawn, marking with small pebbles where the first light touched the ground, and returning at dusk to watch where the shadows swallowed the slope. On the 3rd day, he found the sweet spot, a rectangle of land just south of the rock shoulder, where winter's sun could slip past the high ridges and strike from mid-morning to mid-afternoon. Not as much light as an eastern farmstead, but enough. Enough to warm the logs. Enough to warm the stones he planned to bury in the floor. Enough to serve as the quiet partner to a small winter fire. He knelt and drove 2 stakes into the soil, marking the cabin's future corners. A little farther from water than the other men would tolerate, a little less convenient for hauling supplies, but perfect for fighting winter the way Jed intended to fight it. Down in the cottonwoods, the others split logs, sharpened traps, and argued about where the elk would move when the snows came. Jed worked alone, studying the slope, reading the land, like a map of future warmth. Before you build, he murmured to himself, learn who your neighbors truly are. The sun, the wind, and the stone. When he finally picked up his axe, the site was not just chosen. It was understood. To anyone watching from the cottonwoods below, Jedediah Cole's cabin looked at first disappointingly ordinary. That was intentional. Whatever strange ideas he carried in his head, he knew the outer shell had to earn the respect of the land before it could defy the land. He started by felling straight lodgepole pines, nothing majestic, nothing too thick. Mountain men didn't waste big timber on winter cabins. Jed chose trees with tight grain and minimal twist, the sort masons and carpenters both admired, because they shrank evenly as they dried. He let the logs rest a few days in the shade of the rocks, turning them so the sap bled out and the bark loosened. His notching was the first thing that set his cabin apart. Most trappers cut their notches fast, a saddle notch here, a V-notch there, anything that locked the logs together good enough for one season. Jed worked slower, carving crisp, square notches shaped to bind the corners tight under the weight of the roof. A well-made notch was a handshake between timbers. A bad one was a lifetime invitation to drafts. He laid each course with a mason's mindset, checking for level the way he once checked hearthstone beds. If a log had a natural bow, He placed it where the curve worked with the structure instead of against it. When a knot interfered with a clean joint, he shaved it, sanded it, or swapped the log entirely. Waste of time. The men watching from below thought so, but Jed wasn't building for a season. He was building for a winter that wouldn't show mercy. Once the log shell reached chest height, he paused to chink the gaps first from the outside. Most trappers did one sloppy round of chinking with whatever they could find. Damp moss, mud, old scraps of rawhide, sometimes even snow-packed sawdust. Jed used dry moss mixed with clay, pressing it deep into every gap until the joint looked like a single seam. He would return later to chink the interior too, sealing the wall twice, like he'd been taught on the farms back east. The roof frame came next: stout, ridgepole, evenly spaced rafters, and a slope gentler than what the Rockies usually demanded. The other men raised eyebrows at that. A shallow roof meant snow lingered. But Jed didn't fear snow, he feared wind. A steeper roof could lift in a gale. A flatter one hugged the cabin tight, especially when weighted with spruce boughs and packed soil. He wanted the roof heavy, solid, a lid the winter couldn't pry open. The floor was another quiet act of rebellion. Instead of leaving bare dirt, Jed dug a shallow basin and laid flattish stones he'd scavenged from the creek bank. He tamped soil between them, filling voids until the surface felt firm under his boots. Cold air, he knew, flowed downhill like water. A sunken stone floor would capture that cold and keep it away from the place men slept. From a distance, the finished shell looked normal. A good cabin may be better built than most, but nothing worth a second glance. No one could see the double chinking. No one could see the subtle tilt toward the sun. No one could see the stone under the floor, waiting to play its part. And no one, not a single man in the valley, could see what Jed planned to build inside. Because the outer shell wasn't the point. It was the stage. The true miracle would rise behind it. The first time one of the young trappers stepped into Jedediah Cole's half-finished cabin and saw what he was doing, he stopped in the doorway, as if he'd walked in on madness. "Jed, you're building another cabin inside your cabin." Jed didn't look up. He was crouched near the north wall, marking a line on the floor with a bit of charcoal exactly 15 inches from the log shell. The outer wall stood firm and square behind him, but now he was preparing to raise another wall lighter, thinner, and set just far enough inward to make any practical man grind his teeth. Most mountain men valued space above all else. Space to hang pelts. Space to sleep 3 or 4 to a side. Space for drying racks, tools, boots, rifles, and the eternal clutter of frontier life. Giving up even a foot of width meant sacrificing comfort and usefulness. But Jed wasn't thinking about comfort. He was thinking about control, the control of heat itself. He drove small stakes into the floor to outline the frame, then began building the skeleton of an inner wall, using saplings and rough-hewn planks. It wasn't meant to carry weight. It wasn't meant to stand the test of decades. It was simply a container, an envelope meant to hold the strangest mixture of materials anyone in camp had ever seen. Because Jed had been collecting stuffing all summer, not insulation the way we understand it today, but the frontier version, dry pine needles gathered from shaded hillsides where resin was low. Cured grasses tied in loose bundles. The soft inner bark of downed firs peeled into strips and dried on racks. Little sacks of wool fibers pulled from worn-out socks and winter leggings. Handfuls of shed animal hair brushed from hides before tanning. Even shreds of old moccasins, too thin to patch. It was a pile of what most men would burn, toss, or ignore. But to Jed, it was the building material he never had enough of back east air that stays put. He began stuffing the cavity between the walls, not by jamming materials in tightly, but by packing them in deliberately. Everything had to be nested, layered, and arranged so that thousands of tiny air pockets remained intact. Too loose and cold air would move through. Too tight, and it would conduct heat like a damp hide. Just right, and the air would remain still, serving as the warmest kind of frontier blanket. "Looks like you're lining your walls with bird nests," one of the men joked. Jed smiled without stopping. "Birds stay warm," he said. "Might be something to learn from them." Word spread quickly. Cole's stuffing his walls with trash. He's lost his mind. Man's making a winter palace out of pine needles. Hope he likes sleeping pressed up against a wall of weeds. Even the older trappers' men who respected width of experience more than width of shoulders shook their heads. Space was precious. Time was precious. Why waste both on something so foolish? Yet, as ridiculous as it looked, Jed's system had logic. Each handful he placed created a little world of stillness. Air captured between layers of natural fibers formed micro-pockets that slowed heat's escape the way a good wool coat slows the bite of winter wind. The inner wall's planks sealed it all away, turning the cavity into a quiet engine of warmth. When Jed finally nailed the last board on and smeared a thin layer of mud plaster over the seams, the stupid wall became invisible. All that remained was a smooth surface, plain, unimpressive, unremarkable. There was no sign of the strange materials behind it. No sign of the quiet revolution he had tucked away. No sign of what would happen once winter tightened its fist around the valley. From the outside, the cabin still looked ordinary. But inside, with 15 inches of trash hiding behind rough planks, Jed had built something no trapper in the Rockies had ever seen. A wall that didn't just keep the wind out. A wall that kept heat in. Most men believed cold entered a cabin through the walls. Jedediah Cole knew the truth was far quieter and far more cunning. Cold didn't just push through wood. Cold flowed the way water finds a crack in a riverbank, the way smoke finds a hole in a stovepipe. And if a man didn't understand that movement didn't map it the way he mapped elk trails or creek beds, then no amount of firewood could save him come January. So once the stupid wall was sealed and the stuffing hidden behind its planks, Jed turned his attention to the places most men never bothered to fix. The door gate that needed guarding. A cabin door was the frontier's weakest point. Every time it opened, winter seized the opportunity. Jed built his door small shoulder wide, low enough that a tall man needed to duck. That alone cut the blast of cold by half. But he didn't stop there. Inside the doorframe, he hung a second barrier, a buffalo hide curtain so thick and heavy, it felt like pushing through a winter coat. Not a decorative drape, not a nice-to-have. A cold trap. When the outer door opened, the hide caught the incoming gust. Cold air pooled in the narrow entry, unable to rush straight across the cabin floor. A man could step inside, let the door swing shut, then ease past the hide into the warm interior, without dragging half the valley's frost behind him. Most cabins were wide open from threshold to hearth. Jed's cabin forced winter to earn every inch. The floor, managing the river of cold. Cold air flows downhill. It always has, always will. In a typical cabin, it spills across the floor in waves ankle-deep, knee-deep, sometimes filling the whole room if the fire slackens. Jed refused to let that happen. He dug his floor basin a few inches deeper than the hearth and laid stone across the bottom, flat creek stones collected by hand, each one chosen for its thickness and shape. He tamped dirt between them, creating a smooth, dense surface. The stones had two jobs: absorb heat when the fire burned, warming slowly like the rock wall behind the cabin. Hold cold at the lowest point, keeping it from creeping over a sleeping man. A shallow stone bowl warming on top, trapping cold below simple physics, learned through years of kneeling on cold masonry in New York winters. The ceiling. No place for heat to escape. Heat rises, everyone knows that. But mountain men rarely insulated their ceilings. They packed grass on the roof for waterproofing, not warmth. Jed saw something different. A giant release valve for every BTU he worked so hard to gather. So he added a thin ceiling of planks beneath the rafters, leaving a narrow cavity above it. Into that cavity, he packed more dry grasses, less densely than the walls, but enough to slow the upward march of warm air. The roof above, weighted with boughs and dirt, pressed that insulation tight. Cold couldn't fall from above. Heat couldn't flee into the night sky, mapping the invisible thieves. When Jed finally stepped back from the finished cabin, he didn't admire the craftsmanship. He listened. He crouched near the door and felt for drafts along the floor. He held a wet fingertip beneath the rafters, hunting for invisible leaks. He walked barefoot across the stone, reading the way cold pooled and settled. He stood in silence, watching how the air seemed to stay put, as if winter itself had been halted at the threshold. Because to Jed, this was the real frontier battle. Not man against snow, not fire against frost, but a quiet war between moving air and the man who dared to tame it. With the door guarded, the floor managed, and the ceiling sealed, heat had nowhere easy left to run. And soon, the valley would learn just how powerful that truth could be. Jedediah Cole didn't wait for January to test his ideas. He didn't trust theories. He trusted seasons. By late September, when the aspens had turned gold and the creek shrank into a ribbon of cold glass, the men of Cottonwood Camp were still laughing about his strange double cabin. But Jed had already begun measuring it, not with tools, but with experience. The days were still warm, sometimes brushing the high 70s. In a normal cabin, those afternoons felt suffocating. Heat poured through the logs, bounced off the packed dirt floor, and settled into the air like an unwelcome guest. Men would sit shirtless by the door, fanning themselves and cursing the sun. Jed walked into one of those cabins on a late September afternoon. It felt like a bread oven, stale, unmoving air heat pressing against the skin. Then he returned to his own. No fire, no shade cloth, no tricks. Yet the air inside was cooler than outside by nearly 10 degrees. His stone floor held the chill of the night before. His inner walls had slowed the sun's advance the moment its rays brushed the outer logs. The cabin felt like a spring cellar rather than a trapper's shack. That evening, 2 of the younger men followed him back up the draw, grinning as if expecting to be impressed by nothing. But the moment they stepped through the door, their expressions flattened. One blinked. The other exhaled softly through his nose. "It's nice in here," one admitted. "Feels like the storm cellar back home," said the other. Jed simply nodded. He didn't boast. He didn't explain. He just watched them look around, noticing the absence of heat, the absence of glare, the odd stillness of the air. But autumn only proved half a theory. Winter would judge the rest. The first snow arrived early that year, mid-October, wet and heavy, sticking to everything it touched. Campfires sputtered. Cabin roofs groaned. The creek froze in thin glass sheets along the edges. In most cabins, men retreated to their bunks and fed their stoves a steady diet of lodgepole pine just to push back the damp cold. Faces were hot. Necks were cold. Blankets still smelled of chill. Jed lit his fire once that night. Just once. Not a roaring blaze, just a small, steady burn. When the wood collapsed into glowing coals, he shut the damper, closed the inner hide curtain, and listened to the quiet. Hours passed. The warmth didn't fade. The stone floor drank heat, slowly, greedily. The stuffed walls held it like a clenched fist. The next morning, while men down in the cottonwoods shivered at their hearths, Jed stepped outside and breathed steam into the crisp air. His cabin had stayed warm through the night, without needing a second burn. Still, the camp wasn't convinced. A few nods of respect, perhaps. A few new silences. But underneath it all, the same refrain. Wait till January. That'll show. And January was coming. January arrived with the kind of cold that doesn't just settle, it claims. The valley turned white and brittle, the sky, a flat sheet of pewter. On the morning the storm began, not a single man in Cottonwood Camp guessed how long it would last. By nightfall, they knew they were facing something different. The wind climbed out of the north like a living thing. Not gusts pressure, a force that shoved against the log walls, squeezing through every careless joint. Snow came sideways, needling the skin-burying gear left outside, building waist-high drifts against cabins in a matter of hours. Horses huddled behind makeshift windbreaks. Men double-checked their woodpiles and cursed the storm's timing. For 5 days, the blizzard pinned the camp in place. Inside the standard cabins, men burned wood, like desperate gamblers throwing their last coins at a rigged table. Every log bought them maybe 20 minutes of relief. Move away from the fire, and the cold reached out from the walls like a set of icy fingers. One man wrote in his journal later, "Front side sweatin', backside freezin'." By the third night, the camp's 2 poorest-built cabins were in crisis. The men inside barely slept, feeding their fires constantly just to keep frost from forming along the blankets. If the storm lasted much longer, they'd burn through their entire winter supply. Rumors began to spread. Cole hasn't been down to cut more wood. Smoke barely comes from his chimney. Is he even alive up there? On the morning of the 4th day, when the wind fell to a muffled growl, 4 men wrapped themselves in blankets, grabbed the camp's only thermometer, and trudged up the draw. Snow swallowed their boots. The cold stung their eyes. They checked the first cabin 34 degrees inside. A miserable chill, but survivable. The next cabin 38 degrees. Better, but only near the fire. The corners felt like ice boxes. Then they reached Jedediah Cole's place. He opened the door wearing only a wool shirt, no coat. His breath fogged softly in the air, but he was smiling. Inside the firebox held nothing but a shallow bed of coals. No fresh wood stacked nearby. No frantic feeding of the flames. The men set the thermometer on a crate in the middle of the room and waited. It climbed past 45 degrees, past 50 degrees, past 60 degrees. Finally, it settled at 63 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 30 degrees warmer than the coldest cabin in camp. The men stood in silence. Not us something heavier. A realization that everything they thought they knew about winter survival had been wrong. Jed simply leaned against his inner wall and said, "Don't take my word for it. Take the winter's." And for the first time, no one laughed. The men of Cottonwood Camp wanted to call Jed's cabin a miracle. But Jedediah Cole didn't believe in miracles. He believed in principles, the kind you don't learn from books, but from frostbitten fingers and long winters. After the blizzard, when the thermometer had spoken louder than any argument, undoubtedly the younger trappers pressed him for an explanation. They expected secrets, tricks, something mystical hidden in that strange second wall. Jed shook his head. "Nothing magical," he said. "Just paying attention to what heat wants to do." Then he laid out the whole thing in words simple enough for any man who'd ever sat by a fire to understand. 1. Heat always moves toward cold. Most trappers knew this instinctively, but they didn't understand its relentlessness. Heat didn't leak, it escaped. It clawed for any path outward. And a single thin log wall offered hundreds of escape routes. Jed's double wall wasn't meant to look pretty. It was meant to confuse the cold. Between the outer logs and the inner planks lay thousands of tiny, unmoving pockets of air trapped by pine needles, wool scraps, dried grasses, and bark fibers. Air, Jed explained, was the best insulator God ever made, as long as it stayed still. The materials didn't keep the cabin warm. The stillness did. 2. Wind is the real thief. Jed had watched men fight cold the wrong way for years. They'd build bigger fires instead of blocking the invisible enemy moving air. Wind sliding across a wall sucks heat outward. Draft sliding across a floor steal warmth faster than any log fire can replenish. His tiny entryway, his buffalo hide curtain, his sealed seams, his shallow stone basin, these weren't luxuries. They were soldiers standing guard at the places winter tried to slip in. Cut the drafts, and suddenly the fire stops working overtime. 3. Stone doesn't just sit there. It stores warmth. Jed touched the stones in his floor. Please remember, he said, when the fire burned, the stones drank heat slowly, the way the rock face behind the cabin absorbed sun in late autumn. And when the fire died, the stones exhaled that stored warmth back into the room for hours. Not a torrent, just a steady, quiet release. Most cabins lost heat in minutes. Jed's cabin decayed in slow motion. 4. Warmth has a rhythm. Jed built to match it. A typical frontier fire is a wild beast, hot when fed, weak when ignored. Jed didn't want a beast. He wanted a steady pulse. His walls slowed the loss. His stones slowed the rise and fall. His roof slowed the upward drift. Fire's the drummer, he said. Your walls decide the tempo. The result, Jed's cabin didn't burn hotter. It burned smarter. Each hour of heat stayed inside instead of escaping to the frost. That was the heart of his frontier science. Not equations, not charts. Just one stubborn mountain man, and the laws of physics, learned the hard way, remembered for a lifetime. When the storm finally broke and the valley thawed back into its familiar silence, the men of Cottonwood Camp stopped laughing at Jedediah Cole's stupid wall. But Jed never gloated. He simply went back to mending traps, sharpening blades, and tending the small world inside his cabin, quietly satisfied that winter had answered the argument for him. The older men in camp, the ones who'd survived a dozen winters and buried friends after a few too many mistakes, understood what had just happened. Jed hadn't built a miracle. He'd built a reminder, one carved from stone, wood, and stubbornness, that the frontier rewards thinking as much as strength. And those lessons reach well beyond an 1823 trapper's cabin. 1. Question the old ways, even if everyone else swears they work. Most cabins in that valley were built from habit, not wisdom. Just because a thing has been done for generations doesn't mean it's done right. 2. Understand the principles, not just the techniques. Jed didn't copy anyone. He watched how heat moved, how air flowed, how stone behaved. Once he understood the why, the how came naturally. 3. Experiment while the stakes are small. Autumn was his laboratory. A smart man tests his ideas when the sun is still shining, not when the world is already buried in snow. 4. Share what works, even if it cost you something to learn it. Jed didn't hoard his knowledge. He opened his door, let others feel the warmth, and explained every detail. In a world where comfort was scarce, generosity mattered. 5. Respect evidence more than opinion. The thermometer didn't care about pride, tradition, or ridicule. It told the truth. And Jed let that truth speak louder than any argument. Modern life may not involve beaver traps or blizzards howling through log seams, but winter still finds its way into our homes, through drafts, through bills, through wasted energy. Jed's answer wasn't expensive. It wasn't complicated. It was thoughtful, and that's the heart of Wildward. Finding strength in old knowledge, comfort in simple design, and wisdom in the quiet men who built their lives, one careful choice at a time. If stories like this speak to you, stories of forgotten ingenuity, frontier resilience, and the practical genius of ordinary people, stick around. There are many more waiting just beyond the next ridge.